Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I thought I had buried since the Realm Reborn days, Final Fantasy XIV netcode. With the recent addition of the Fall Guys event, many people have come to notice some oddities in how the game decides whether or not you were actually hit by an attack, or in this case, an obstacle. This has led to many questioning the game's netcode itself, blaming it on the constant case of "I was definitely out of that" sideswipes they've taken across the various maps. Funnily enough, this topic hasn't really been that popular since Final Fantasy XIV's relaunch with A Realm Reborn a decade ago. It's had bits and pieces during Heavensward Stormblood. It really depends on the kind of content that's out at the time, but it was huge at the start of Realm Reborn for the first half a year or so. When Final Fantasy XIV came out, this was a frequent criticism, especially on Titan Hard Mode, where landslides and the notoriously fast weight of the land AoEs claimed many a young player's dreams of getting there clear. Back in A Realm Reborn patch 2.0, the game actually did have a major netcode problem. You see, in their haste to get the game live to the player base, I don't remember if it was their hardware or their optimization of said hardware that was lacking, but it was so bad that the game had a built-in 300 ms latency before factoring in whatever your actual ping was. So if you had 200 ms ping on top of that, you basically needed to react to things about half a second faster than the game intended you to. Basically memorize every fight and move out of attacks well in advance. I still don't know how one of my pals who is raiding from an army base with 500 ms, I don't know how he did coil, but he did, and that just goes to show you it was possible, but that doesn't mean it was good. This issue was actually, I'm going to put this in quotes, resolved back in 2.1 when the game's innate latency was brought to, at least in the dev team's words at the time, to industry standard. This reduced the innate latency to 100 ms, and people quickly learned that the 200 ms difference wasn't really the only reason they couldn't dodge Way to the Land. No, they just didn't dodge it in the first place. Anyway, that's the last known instance of them reporting on whatever the innate latency is. We have no idea if this has improved at all. There's not really much else to say. We just have to assume for the point of the video that that's what's there. There's a built-in 100 ms latency. That being said, since patch 2.1, we've still had that report of, but I wasn't in that, upon people taking deaths they felt were undeserved. This has frequently led back to the complaint about the netcode being bad, but unfortunately, in this particular case, that's not really the true culprit behind things. Don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy XIV should be looking to improve aspects like netcode and keep them up to date in whatever way possible. They have shortcomings in places like the delay between skills. You know how everyone's like, oh, put two OGCDs between a GCD for this opener and that. And for half the people, depending on what instance you're even in the game, sometimes the ability to do that can just change, and it can be really hard to play jobs optimally, even when you have low ping. There's even something more actively netcode related that I'm actually going to talk about later in this video that does have to do with the Fall Guys event, so we'll get to that then. And also, from what more technical people have told me, I didn't know this, so this is secondhand. Please feel free to just say this is wrong, because I don't know anything about it. Apparently, the game has a somewhat predictive movement feature, where the game somewhat calculates your movements before they happen to help mitigate that innate latency. From what I'm told, it's the reason why clips like this can happen to me at a super low latency in the first place. I'm in that. I'm dead. But apparently people have told me that the game thinks I'm out of it because I was moving out of it and my latency was so low that it superseded the 100 ms. I don't know. I got this whole huge written explanation about how people didn't understand how it worked, and that was essentially the TLDR of it. But yeah, I guess that's there. So if that's not true, feel free to tell me, because that's just what I got an essay about at some point. But the complaint that most people should actually be levying when it comes to stuff like Fall Guys is how the game's mechanics are communicated to the player. There's a misconception, a very reasonable one I might add, that when an animation for an attack goes off, that's when the attack actually hits. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Final Fantasy XIV more consistently bases whether or not you've been hit by something solely based on the cast bar of a skill finishing. If it doesn't have a cast, then just the moment the game decides to use that skill for instant hit abilities. So okay, let's say a monster or boss or whatever starts casting a skill. You see a cast bar and it finishes and the attack goes off. If you are in the line of fire when that cast bar finishes, 95% of the time that means the game has determined you were hit by it. However, the animation may take several full seconds to resolve, so the game's not going to communicate that you got hit by it until the animation goes off. Even though the server decided you were dead 2 or 3 seconds prior, it's going to wait until the animation would have collided with the location that it determined you were in at the time of failing the mechanic. The delay in communicating to the player is really where the problem lies. And it's funny to me because the easiest solution to that is to make certain attacks just less grandeur. You know, Final Fantasy as a franchise loves its wacky, crazy, over-the-top animations for everything. That's true in 14 as well. I'm sure a lot of us appreciate it when we just look at something in a bubble like, oh my god, that thing looks crazy. But in an MMO, that's kind of off-putting to be blasted by something you quote-unquote failed to dodge server side, but were super out of client side. Even with this perfectly reasonable explanation that I'm sure some of you get and you go, oh, okay, that makes sense. That doesn't mean you feel better about it. It doesn't change the fact that it feels terrible on the receiving end of attacks that you weren't in visually. And if you're newer to the game, what are you just going to expect the person to know that or to have to explain this to them every single time there's a new person? No, it's confusing. So I'm not like saying it's an excuse. I'm just explaining how it works and saying that's not really so much a netcode thing as much as it is they don't have really quick and snappy animations, because the game is saying, hey, in the moment we decided this attack went off, that is when you were in it, you got hit by it. That makes total sense. It's just the extra 2 seconds to actually be flung into the wall or whatever it takes. That's confusing. And Fall Guys is one of the most egregious examples of this. There's so many obstacles and mechanics and AoEs going off all the time that the less proper visual tells just don't really end up well. And honestly, it's less clear than some endgame content is. You can't see the cast bars, animations are quick and sudden, and you're actively rushing against tons of other players. So when you get hit by something, you're not sitting there going, well, you know, on the server side, you know, I think I was in that, but you know, no, you're just like, come on, I didn't deserve that. You know, you're going up against different players with different latency, pings, ISPs, all that stuff, who may not be having the same issues as you or may have mastered their own. So there's actually like a skill diff here, but it's in the weirdest way possible. Now that's for the parts that don't really have that much to do with the netcode, but netcode communicating to the player is actually still a thing you need to consider. And there's another part of the Fall Guys collaboration that absolutely you can blame on netcode. With the attacks not matching up to deaths, that's contrasting design decisions between how a player's death is communicated server side versus how it's visually shown inaccurately. The other half is how players communicate their position to each other, and that is definitely something that they should look at. Many of you have either experienced or seen a clip of someone making it to the crown first, but a person behind them claiming the victory instead. This has to do with how a player's position is registered server side versus how it's communicated to other players' client side. On your client, you know, you make an action like walking forward, it gets sent to the server registers it based on latency before sending that information to other players' clients. Because of this, someone on your client who is actually a bit behind you is either running dead even with you or even potentially ahead of you, depending on the distance. But on their screen, you are lagging behind them in the same manner. The truth is that both of you are probably neck and neck, and that it's going to come down to a photo finish on who gets the crown. This is the kind of thing that netcode can absolutely be blamed for, because this failure in communication is entirely about accurately displaying player positions against one another. And in something like Fall Guys, that matters a lot. Like, yeah, it's good to know that the server side position is correct, that 14's not miscommunicating that part of it, but if they need to make an improvement on anything, this should be a top priority. And honestly, it's been a huge problem from casual to hardcore for, well, pretty much ever. Ever had an issue with a tether not being picked up even though they're standing right between each other, even if they're just wiggling a bit? Or maybe you pass a debuff through someone even though you didn't actually touch them, but then on the next pull, you both pass right through each other and somehow it doesn't passes. Ever been ahead of someone who has a spread AoE? You're not in each other's AoEs, but you both still get killed? Heck, have you ever had one where somehow only one person gets killed by an instant kill spread AoE? All of that are different cases of the netcode being a problem. These often occur because players are attempting to make decisions based on what their client is showing them, which isn't accurate enough in these small moments. At the end of the day, Fall Guys is just showing more people something that those of us who have played for a very long time, especially endgame raiders, have kind of just had to get used to. We make much more careful and deliberate decisions because we've had years and years of experience in these style of things. We know when we can do dumb things like actually go directly through the animation for an AoE because we're so used to our own server side position and our latency that we can make that judgment call. Whereas other people who are just trying to play the game visually for what it's showing them aren't able to do that. So there's all sorts of just, they're problems. You know, I guess at the end of the day, I don't want to diminish that these are things that Final Fantasy XIV could do better. I just felt the compulsion to explain exactly what is happening to people so that when we're targeting feedback on these kind of things, that we know fully what it is we're trying to say and what we're trying to get across. Could animations be snappier so that way there's less confusion about this? Absolutely. Could they make improvements, at least I'd like to assume, to the way that player position is communicated against one another? Absolutely. I have to believe that those things are possible. Not necessarily easy, especially given that the game, you know, was kind of put together with duct tape and a hope and a dream way back in 2013 when they had to redo the whole thing. But you have to believe that it's doable and it's possible. I almost wonder if the cloud servers are going to help with anything like this at all. I don't know how the server side versus client side communication is going to work, and I'm very interested to find out when we get the data center test in the coming week. But what else is there to say at this point? We just need to be vocal about it, to speak about it, and hopefully it's something that's taken a little bit more seriously. We have actually seen these types of communications improved in the past. You know, animations like, I guess, like Monk Buff going off, or like Grease Lightning when they had that, or I guess a better example is procs for Black Mage and the actual registration of stuff like Astral Fire and Umbral Ice. You know, those used to be based on the animation for Fire and Ice. So if you had a second left on Astral Fire and you shot a fireball, you had to wait till the fireball actually hit in order, sorry, my phone went off. The fireball actually hit before you would get the Astral Fire buff. Even though the server already knew you had sent it, it was waiting for the animation to communicate it to you. So you could lose Astral Fire even though you finished the cast on time, which goes completely against the whole cast bar is done. The server should know better. They have resolved that, where now as soon as the cast finishes, it registers that you shot the fireball. It works better for procs, works better for buff maintenance. So they've shown they can absolutely improve that level of communication. It just may not make sense to do it in all places in their eyes, but I think they could still do a better job than they're currently doing now, and it's worth having a discussion about. Anyway, just seemed like a fun discussion to add, just to add my part to the mix as someone with years and years of experience in this game and all of its little quirks and all that stuff. So to continue the discussion in the comments section below, really curious to see what people will have to say about what they have in this video. And if they have anything to add, there's almost certainly things that even I don't know about it, because I don't really get too deep into things. I usually catch discussions about the stuff that goes really, really deep into how Final Fantasy XIV's netcode works. So I'm very curious to read my own comment section on this video, because I think there's probably going to be some fun facts in there that I didn't know. But that's going to be a wrap for this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care.